Thank you, Tony, and thank Frank and everybody at MCC Brussels for the invitation to this very prestigious and important event. I've only got a few minutes, as Tony says, and there's too much to talk about, so I was going to say, sorry, I've got no time for nuance. But as it happens, I don't think it is a time for nuance and balance and being careful and sitting on fences. In any case, I think we're in the middle of a political war, and it's important to take sides and start fighting. We're faced with a potentially historic opportunity in Europe with the populist revolt, and with the advent of the approach of the European elections, the shift towards what we might call sovereigntist, national, conservative, parties that stand against the centralised power of Brussels is noticeable. 5 years ago in the last European elections, I was one of a small team in a room above a shop in London running Nigel Farage's campaign for the Brexit Party, and we won the European elections 6 weeks after the Brexit Party was launched. Proof that even in boring old Britain, anything can happen in politics these days. Now I think we're looking at a Brexit-style revolt across Europe in terms of a populist demand for more democracy and taking back control, to borrow a slogan. 5 years later. Obviously, the elections haven't happened yet, and as our friends, the farmers of Europe, would tell us, don't count your chickens before they're hatched, but nevertheless, we can hope that there is an important historic shift underway. Today's the first day of spring, looking out the window, if we believe in the old money, the planets rather than the science. Today is the first day of spring, and it reminds me really of another spring, 1848, when a wave of democratic national revolutions against the ancient regime swept across Europe in what was described as the spring of nations, the people's spring. And I think spring 2024 is an opportunity for another people's spring, another spring of nations in a revolt against the centralisation of Brussels' power. Of course, at that time of 1848, in response to that national revolutionary upsurge, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote their famous, or many would say infamous, Communist Manifesto, which begins with a phrase that captured the fear of the old regime about the revolutions, that a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. And if we want to capture the fears of the new establishment in Europe today, the spectre that they see haunting Europe is definitely the spectre of populism. And they're trying to denigrate it and defame it. You'll see many references to the virus of populism, something that's catching, we've got to be vaccinated against. The system's got to be vaccinated against it. We see many attempts to denigrate anybody who they call populist as far right. Everything is far right if it's outside of the increasingly narrow mainstream and must be quarantined to the point where they now want to have a serious discussion about banning the second or third most popular party in Germany. When the establishment starts talking about banning their political opponents, we better take them seriously and realise that we're in a real fight for the future of democracy and freedom in Europe. Alongside those attempts to denigrate and quarantine populism, they try to denigrate it by saying, for example, they talk about the farmers. Oh, these poor farmers, they're just innocent saps who are being exploited by these terrible extremists. You know, and if we could just give them a few grains, that they'll be satisfied. I saw one expert saying that what the farmers should do is, when they turned up with their tractors to protest, fly a rainbow flag from their tractor, which would ward off the far right, like hanging garlic, you know, to keep the vampires at bay. So they're either trying to denigrate or to belittle this kind of popular revolt, and completely underestimating that what we're seeing here is a fundamental divide between the European elites, the EU elites, and the peoples of Europe. Something which has always been inherent in the structures of the European Union. We can talk about that. Their contempt for national sovereignty and democracy was built into it from 1958. Or as the recently departed Jacques Delors put it, they run a system of what they call benign despotism rather than democracy as a way of running Europe. But that divide, that tension has really come to the surface now with this so obvious reality gap between the policies presented by the EU elites in Brussels and what it means for millions of Europeans on the ground in terms of the green transition, in terms of mass migration and the destruction of a whole way of life. What we see is really two Europes becoming something which has always been inherent in European politics coming to the surface in this stark way. I thought it was great that the Portuguese populist movement that did so well in the election recently, was called Chega, which is, I understand, Portuguese for enough. And that's really what we're seeing, is a people saying, not with some detailed programme, as Frank said, for changing the world, but just saying enough of this, and we want to push back against it. And that is a tremendous opportunity for those of us who want to change and want to resist the centralisation of power in Brussels to relate to them. And I think we've got to go on the offensive in order to do that and not give an inch. When they attack populism, we ask them, what do you mean by that? When I first started talking about this 12 or 15 years ago, I remember looking up the meaning of populism in the Cambridge Dictionary, a definition I've used on various occasions. It defines populism as political ideas and activities that are intended to get the support of ordinary people by giving them what they want. We can't have that. Giving ordinary people what they want. So we should embrace populism. It began as a positive statement by the Populist Party in America, and we should bring it back as a positive thing that we're prepared to embrace. And when they call us far right, we should try and turn it around and say, what exactly is it that they're attaching this label to? If we look at recent political events and how they've been reported as far right. Is it now far right to hate Hamas? Because that's what you get called if you stage a counter-protest against the Islamist anti-Semitic demonstrations in London. It's far right. Is it now far right to hate the genocidal Islamists of terrorists of Hamas? Is it now far right to support the farmers in their demands for decent livelihoods and demands to be allowed to produce the food that Europe needs, because that's the label they've attached to it? Is it far right to insist that there are only two sexes and that a man should not be allowed to masquerade as a woman in women's spaces? Is that far right? Because that's what you will call now if you get involved in a gender-critical discussion of these political issues. Or is it far right, as even the Daily Mail, who I write for in London, described the process, is it far right to be a parent protesting against pornographic drag acts parading before children in schools and libraries in Britain? Because that's what the media described them as, far right. Turn it round. Guilty as charged. We're going to stand for those issues, regardless of what label they seek to attach to us. So whatever they call us, I think we've got to stick to our guns for sovereignty and for democracy, and try to arm the people with the arguments that can give a voice to their needs in the campaign to the European election. Spring is sprung. As the opposition would say, never waste a crisis. We've got to seize this opportunity. But the only way we're going to make it work, it's our slogan to begin with, is no surrender. Thank you very much.